Okay. I just have a couple of questions about your book.
Sure.
So what inspired you to write Joanna the Deaf Princess?
Well, I have written books about deaf individuals, and deaf individuals have really kind of inspired me over the years. And I think about a particular person in history. She was a deaf princess, and I had known a few deaf individuals from the International History Group who have decided to take upon the research to learn more about her. So I actually flew to Scotland. There was actually a Deaf History International Conference that I was attending at the time, and I was presenting a little bit about what we do here in Wisconsin regarding deaf history. This particular book was actually a British book originally on the history of deaf individuals, and as I looked through this book on deaf history in England, there was a very small reference, not a lot of information available, about a princess who was deaf. But unfortunately, she didn't know sign language, so she was taught only lip reading and speech. And so, actually, the prince, James, was the one who married Beatrice, who then had the daughter, Joanna. And I found this information here, and I was thrilled to bring that particular piece of research home to do more work to write this story, and that was several years ago. So I read all the information that I could on the internet about Joanna, this deaf princess, and I didn't find a lot of information about that. And she was married, she did have children, and of course her father was a king of Scotland, and then he had a wife, like I mentioned, Beatrice. And then, of course, you had all of the brothers and sisters that are depicted in that image. But I could not find a lot of images of Joanna. That was the most interesting part. So I decided to write a fiction history book for children that put her as the main character, even though that there wasn't a lot of history about her. And so, of course, when you think about all kinds of role models for deaf children that there are in history, there are not many that are written about, although there are children of, deaf royalty over the years. So I went ahead and contacted an individual from Orange Hat. Her name is Shannon. And Shannon is from Orange Hat Publishing, and she actually was a graduate here of the interpreter training program. We know each other very well. And so I asked her what she thought about this particular book, and she sent it to her publisher, and the publisher read it and was incredibly impressed. They contacted me. I went ahead and had the book published. Of course, that goes through an editing process. We brought the book back and forth to one another, and then I've been selling it ever since. I think people don't realize that the deaf community have history too. And I know that, like in Disney, they do show lots of different historical fiction movies. I would really hope that they would pick mine as a movie that they would make.
That is so cool. I'm actually just going to adjust this because I don't think I can see your signing from here. Okay. Yeah.
You want me to repeat my answer? Or?
No, I think I could catch it. I just want to, make sure.
Okay.
Okay, next question. What was the publishing process like, and did it take a long time for you to get published?
Well, I would have to say about a month. It went back and forth between various editing processes. And then after the fourth time, they asked me some more clarifying questions on the details in my book, and then it was approved for publishing. So it didn't go through a very long process at all.
Okay.
I have to say, from what I understand, 4 times is not difficult. I know that there are times where a book has to go through maybe 6 or 7 different layers of editing. So I was very fortunate. one of the things that I give advice to authors is make sure that you dot your I's and cross your T's on the first time around, so it doesn't have to go through that much editing. Because publishers are not always patient, but the publisher I worked with was very patient with me, and so we just brought it back and forth a few times, and they published it.
Super cool. So what kind of research did you do for Joanna the Deaf Princess, and what was that process like for you?
Well, a lot of them involved a lot of book reading and searches on the internet. Unfortunately, I could not find enough information to write the book as a nonfiction book, so I had to move and shift my thought to a fictional book. So she is an historical figure, but the story is fictional. So that's like a history fiction book is very much like, and that's why that's in the book. So some of the details have some artistic liberty to it. But I would have to say that the fictional character is not fictional. She's actually a real person. I think I probably, this happened like 500 to 600 years ago. Not a lot was written back then. So, Now, some of the information that I had about her family, about the father and the mother, where they were buried, that information I was able to kind of use for my creative liberty, but there still was not a lot of information. The family is buried in Scotland, and they do have a family burial site, so that was information that inspired me as well. So I was able to actually go out to the burial site while I was in, or I would like to go to that area someday to actually see the grave sites of that family that I wrote about. But again, there wasn't a lot of very good information that I could find on that character. But I did my best. That's all I can do.
So was your original aim to write nonfiction about Joanna? Okay.
That is correct. I would prefer it had been a non-fictional book, but just not enough information. Now, I have been looking at how Disney movies are written, and I have to say, a lot of them have a very similar style, where they have a fictional character involved, but they do a lot of artistic liberty to add some of the fictional details to it, so it's not much different. Have you ever seen the movie Pocahontas? Right?
Yeah.
Same idea. That is a true story, but a lot of the details in there, probably you would have a hard time finding some validity to those, but that's what made it a movie.
Do you have any unpublished, unfinished books? How many? And will you ever finish those that you haven't finished?
Well, actually, I'm writing my second book right now, and it is on Ed Water Street, who is a deaf actor, and he was actually born in Wisconsin. And so I'm writing his biography as we speak, and that is going to be a nonfiction book for children. And then I have another book that I'm writing about George Viditz. And he is deaf himself. He was a well-known leader back in the 1800s, and he worked very diligently to preserve American Sign Language. He actually did his movement back in 1913. And so right now I'm looking for a deaf artist that would work with me as an illustrator, and then we're going to go ahead and publish that book as well. So whenever I can find someone that would be willing to partner with me, I'll have that book published. Could be 1 to 3 years, I would say, but in the next few years you'll see another book from me.
I look forward to it. What was your writing process like in general?
Well, I did a lot of research, of course. I made a lot of outlines of the kind of things I wanted to include in the story. A lot of the things included the characters, the backstory on some of the characters, and then I just started to write the story. When I was done, of course, I had to go back because there were some of the details I wasn't satisfied with, and then I made a lot of changes myself before I could even take it to the publisher. When I was personally satisfied with it, then I submitted it for publishing. But I would have to say, from when I first wrote it to when I took it to the publisher the first time, about 6 months.
Okay. Is that process similar in the ones you're currently writing?
I would say so, yes. At this point, I've written my first draft of the book, and so hopefully within about 6 months it should be published. Now, the writing part of it sometimes can take a lot more time, of course, because there's a lot of internal editing, but it depends on the book. Sometimes it could take as much as 6 months to a year for a shorter book. But it's a children's book, so it'd take about 6 months.
How many hours a day do you typically spend writing? An hour or two every day. But because I teach here full-time, I'm a pretty busy guy, but I also spend time with my writing. So I would say between an hour to 2 hours every day I devote to my book. And how do you balance the teaching and the writing?
Well, I am very fortunate because I don't work during the summer, so I can devote more writing time to the summer. And so I only teach one class during the summertime, but when it gets to fall, I'm in my full course load, and so I don't have a lot of time. So I try to do what I can to do most of my writing during the summertime, because I don't have a lot of opportunities to teach class during the summertime or during the winter, and so I use that time for my writing.
Do you find you're happy with that balance?
Actually, I'm pretty happy with that. I think that when I get the idea for a book, I just get started. And I really haven't, had a new one yet, but if I do have some good ideas, I get them down. So, it is a balance. Sometimes the moment just hits me and then I try to write down as much as I can. Like, Joanna, the Deaf Princess was just kind of one of those thoughts that I write down. And sometimes I have these really great lines and ideas that I want to write down and I have to do it immediately before I forget. Now, that is one of the things I recommend as well. If you have some ideas milling around in your head about a book, write it down immediately, because sometimes what can happen is that you get distracted with other things, then you forget what your great ideas were.
Do you believe there is enough literature featuring deaf individuals?
I definitely think there's not enough deaf characters in literature right now. I think I would love to see more characters highlighted that are deaf in all kinds of literature. Having a deaf publisher would be helpful as well. I think we should have more of those. I'm very fortunate because the publisher that I work with right now is hearing and she knows sign language. It would be really great to have a deaf publisher. And so that was Orange Hat Publishing Company. I developed a good relationship with them, and it's been a good relationship ever since.
Have you read many books featuring deaf individuals? If so, do you think those authors have portrayed deaf culture truthfully? Why or why not?
Well, as far as deaf characters, I really don't prefer to have, like in movies and things like that, have a hearing person play the role of a deaf character. I mean, as a deaf individual, I really wanted to make sure that deaf people were highlighted in their roles. But I think that what is great about having a deaf character in a book that's actually historical is that other people can connect with her, especially deaf children. So I think it's important that you make sure that deaf characters are portrayed in the right way to see the community appropriately. Now, me as a deaf individual, I mean, I am very familiar with the experience of a deaf individual. We have our joys, our celebrations, then we have our struggles through oppression. So I think that some of the stories that I actually write have personal connections with my story as well. So there are a lot of hearing writers really have to understand what the deaf experience is before they can write about them. And so even if you have a deaf character in any piece of literature and a hearing person's writing about them, they may not be able to portray them properly. Let me give you an example of that. There was one book, the book that I wrote about with the princess, right? I actually communicated with a couple of deaf individuals. Water Street also had some input on that, and when I told him that I was interested in writing about George Vadis, we had a great conversation. And he wanted to find a way to get more information about the book that we're writing. Now, one of the things that's important is when you get to the details of deaf characters, you have to make sure that they are real to life. You know, just having that opportunity to use our natural language with one another, not having any problems, not having any communication barriers is going to be really important. So being able to collaborate with another deaf individual is really good. However, if I had to do that exclusively with a hearing person that didn't understand us, that would be very difficult. So I think that it's important that when you are working with a publisher or anybody that you're collaborating on to have a good, comfortable relationship. Like for me, I'm seeking out another deaf individual. I wouldn't do that with another hearing person that didn't understand sign language.